is, as many other things we've encountered in the last 3 months with the effect of the pandemic and sometimes seismic shifts, there is an anticipation that public funding will be subject to reduction. The state is in serious deficit in terms of outspending their resources. No one can honestly predict the strength and consistency of federal assistance to local governments. UHLS is having forums on reduction, and I just listened to their first one. Evelyn very nicely put it on, made available to a link on her email, and she attended the meeting. And Tim Burke has done an awful lot of nice work on reopening and providing everybody guidance. And so I just listened to it. It was interesting. So I think there is some sense on UHLS's part that they're targeting a 20% reduction in their resources for budget. And they basically don't have any firm data, but that's their estimated anticipation. And so I thought we could spend some time talking about ourselves and what our resources are for income, and make some estimate as to what might be a challenge. I put on the agenda a qualified reduction WAG amount. Marie asked me on email what WAG was, and I said it stands for wild ass guess, because we don't have any firm information other than the 20% recommended target for UHLS, but that too is based on estimates and anticipation. So let's just talk for a while about what we may think. And I haven't taken any action yet, but I don't know who it was that talked to, I think the the deputy mayor. But in terms of our tax levy assignment, it's been fixed for this year, but it is not fixed for next year. So there's a great fear, I think, that the tax receipts on the part of the city may be diminished because of the effect of unemployment, the effect of there are many privately owned rentals, and there's been a disruption in the consistency of rentals. People as high as 30% not paying rents. And it's anticipated when the legal system gets back to normalcy in terms of tenant issues, there may be a lot of evictions. I think 44% of the rental units are owned by small businesses that may not be able to absorb drastic decreases. So if indeed the city's collection of taxes is diminished just without any other change, we may see a diminishing of our tax levy support in next year's budget. Does anybody have any further discussion about Troy's condition and the potential impact for 2021 tax levy?
I wanted to address, it could impact us with the July 31st tax collection. So that would affect us in this year. Because if people can't pay their property taxes for July 31st, we don't get that money. So it's not just the effect on next year, it's the effect on our revenues for this year.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification.
I just want to say too, to just outline a little bit where we are. We did receive another payment from the city yesterday. So total payments for 2020 so far are about 4% ahead of 2019 in the same exact period, which is about right since our tax levy increase was pegged at 6.2%. So basically, tax collection at the present moment is about where it should be.
How much was this check for?
16,000, 15, something like 15.5 or something in that neighborhood.
It's not, it's not unusual to get a greater percentage of the tax payments in the beginning of the year. Some people pay their taxes in advance, so they'll pay the full year.
No, I'm saying it's 4% ahead of exactly the same period for last year. I'm not saying for the whole year, just for the period, you know, if you compare it exactly with last year. We get checks at about the same rate every year and about the same time. So it's, you know, it's a good idea. It's a good way to tell, you know, tax collections. We'll know more, a great deal more, I assume, if we check on July tax results.
Paul, do you have an idea of where the small amounts that are coming, not 15,000, not a small amount, but the taxes, the monies that you get, is that from delinquencies from prior years, or is it this year's taxes that dribbled in, or do you know why you're getting that, these small amounts periodically and then two large amounts?
I think it's both. I think in some cases it's delinquency, in some cases late payments.
Could you just say the last thing you said? It was hard to understand.
Late payments.
Late payments.
Yeah, some are delinquencies, and those are labeled delinquencies. I think some are just late payments, which we get throughout the year. The city basically sends us whatever they collect.
Yes, but you have no knowledge whether it's a late payment of this year or a delinquent payment of a past year.
They do indicate delinquent payments. I forgot now whether they indicate the exact year. They may. They send us a printout, which is a report of actual payments. So we know who's paid what.
Okay. Very good. So you're saying it's trended up 4% or compared to last year?
Yeah, it's about 4% ahead of last year at this time.
Now, was there a planned increase from last year to this year?
Yes, 6.2%.
Was that about 4% as well? So
That's fairly close.
okay, so you haven't noticed any diminishing collection?
Not yet.
Okay. And Marie, did you say somebody had a discussion with Monica that would, along the same lines of there's some anticipation of mid-year delinquencies?
I did. I spoke with her about it and told her I was projecting roughly about 10% below based on some past figures.
Okay.
And she thought that, she indicated that that was a reasonable figure to use until we had more precise data from the July 31st tax collection.
Right. Okay. Well, 10% may be a good figure to use. I don't know. And with UHLS, they were recommending targeting a 20% reduction in their support based on the conversations about how far the state is.
If I could address that for a minute.
Yes, please do.
We do have to keep in mind that different libraries and different systems have different problems. The 20%, or the reason for that, is that the governor has stated specifically that the budget will be reviewed twice a year, actually 3 times a year. It's already been reviewed once, but 2 more times in order to make up for the deficit that the state has. The state has an enormous deficit that they hope the federal government will cover. So far, it's not being covered. When they revisit their budgets to try to close this gap, it's going to hit everybody. And that was the estimate, one estimate that would happen to library systems throughout the state.
Right.
We're not exactly in that same position. We have an approved tax levy based on, last year's election. Generally, when you have an approved tax levy, theoretically that a full amount is to be turned over to the library. We don't benefit from sales tax, which is taking a hit already. We don't really know yet what the impact is going to be on property taxes. As you know, property taxes are a fairly serious business. They kind of need to be paid at some point. And a lot of people are pretty much aware of that. So I think right now it's difficult to estimate. We will know more, I think, after the July collection. But we're not in the same situation as Upper Hudson.
Now, we don't get any direct funding from UHLS. The money flows the other way.
Well, that money is actually state aid. It comes through UHLS and then is passed on to the libraries. In our case, that's only about, let's see, what do we have? 15,000, between 14 and 15,000 is state aid. Again, that could be cut. You don't know. I mean, the state is desperately trying to make up that huge deficit and hoping that the federal government will step in and help them out.
Now, when I said in the of people paying rent for owners, 44% of rental properties are small businesses. That's not 44% of the tax rates and of the owners in Troy. I mean, we have corporation owning large corporations with deep pockets. We have many homeowners, some of us on this call. And so if there's an anticipation of turmoil in the rental owned properties, it's still, as a percentage, when we start looking at what percentage might we begin to determine we should try to target for anticipated needed savings for the future, because that's really what this meeting is let's strategically look at these issues now with estimates, but be more detailed in our plans about where we might be able to find the savings. So we've covered the taxes. Are there other sources of income that will be subject to decline?
I think fundraising may decrease as well.
Yeah, other organizations that I'm associated with have seen fairly sharp decreases in fundraising if they're not directly human services, healthcare, food, shelter.
Friends' contribution may be reduced. The bookseller hasn't been open for, what, 2 months? Losing track of time. The community foundation, the investment in the community foundation, depending on how the market's done, whether or not there'll be something over the corpus that they can even distribute to the library. You know, again, these are just things to think about.
My concern with UHLS is that they provide very important services. And if they are looking at a 20% decrease in support, that they might look to libraries, member libraries, to help make up that difference. So
One of the issues where we don't have that 3-year contract, Upper Hudson, East Greenbush had requested that the dollar amount only go for 1 year. The contract stays for 3 years, but the actual dollar amount would be reviewed. And I think at some point that could be an issue as they reevaluate that piece. Plus, yeah, I don't think there's a question that services may be affected. That 20%, if you listen to Governor Cuomo, he talks about 20% cut to education, 20% cut to healthcare, 20%, unless the federal government helps, starts to participate in funding these things. But that could affect Upper Hudson too. And I think Upper Hudson was picking that number based on some historic situations that they've had to deal with before. So they're looking at the possibility. And again, everything's just a possibility. It's an ongoing saga of 20%. And I do know when they dealt with the smaller cut, you could see the line that said member services was reduced by a small amount. So who knows what will happen next time and how that will be defined.
Paul, could you review the status of our contract with UHLS? We recently signed, is it a 3-year contract?
Yeah, I'm trying to recall here. We do have a contract for service with UHLS. It was supposed to be 3 years.
It is.
You know, those are all signed, you know, I don't, I don't know what difference it would make. If they don't have the money, we don't have a contract.
Yeah.
So, you know, either party can cancel with, you know, proper notice.
Well, we'll still have a contract. The question is how much will each library be paying in to that program, you know?
Yeah, but that doesn't support the whole automated system.
This is true. But,
There's
you know,
money that comes out of UHLS that helps to support that system.
So Paul, if we were trying to get an anticipated deficiency with the changes in UHLS, would you look at annual payments for the services and target 20% of those? Or is there another mechanism to come up with a dollar amount as to what we might be facing in terms of deficit?
Okay, I'm not sure I understand the question. Why, I don't know what UHLS was doing in there.
In his conference about the present situation and reopening,
Yeah,
Tim Burke said that they are targeting 20% decline in state support.
right.
And so for us, because we're a taxing group, our fiscal relationship with them by contract is for the services they provide. If we had a 20% increase for the services that they provide, can we quantify that?
Yeah, I suppose we could. You know, right now, let's see, what is our bill?
percent for this year?
Right.
While Paul's looking for that, can I say something? I think personally, I think we would be very, very naive to think that there isn't going to be some kind of budget impact on the library. You just have to read the news to see that, there is going to be pain. We don't know how much pain, but we should plan for it, because right now we have a balanced budget. We don't have a surplus. We don't have a deficit. We have a balanced budget, which would mean that we've budgeted for what we planned to spend all the money that we have coming in and not a penny more. And if we have less money coming in by the end of the year, we're going to be in a deficit situation, and we're going to have to correct for that. And it seems to me the best way to handle that would be to pick a couple of different levels of deficit and plan for them, and figure out that if we have 5% less revenue coming in, by the end of the year, this is what we would cut. If it's 10%, this is what we would cut. If it's 20%, this is what we would cut, because we're going to have to respond at the point at which we get there. And I think, Bob, what you were intended from this meeting was to start having that conversation, so that we're not in a situation where the money isn't coming in and we don't know what we're going to do. Is that correct?
Yes, I agree with you entirely. That's an approach. What I thought I was going to try to do in this section of the meeting is, if we could get to some wild idea about a quantity, then we could plan for not necessarily that quantity plus 20%, and still come up with a bracketed plan. By having some specific target, whether it's arrived at as you just did, which is, let's take our costs and plan for 10% less or 20% less, and see if we can attach actions to those figures. I was just trying to get to some wild idea of what it might be, and then do that same thing. So
Yeah.
it's six
Yes.
of one, half a dozen of another.
Yeah. Yeah, so for me, when I look at the demographics of the city of Troy, and I look at where the tax revenue is coming from the city of Troy, this is not a super wealthy city. We're not Bedford Hills. So we're likely to have, while, there are lots of people who own buildings, whether they're landlords, private, small companies, or large companies, we're likely to see impact on tax receipts. And we're likely to see a higher level than a wealthy community.
All right, let's just try to stay at this for another 5 minutes, and then we'll conclude. Paul, were you able to get a figure?
Yeah, we budgeted 18,000 for automation. That could increase to 23,000 as an additional expense that we would need to put in. Again, it's sort of a guess.
Okay, I wasn't on this. You said, so the UHLS contract is 18,000, and then you said 22. I didn't understand what you said.
Yeah, I think the additional cost, if we had to kick in an additional cost, might be 22 or 23,000.
Bringing it up to 22, 23, or paying an additional 22 to 20?
That would be additional, yeah.
To 20, so over double.
Well, we already planned for 18,000.
Okay, so
Yeah.
bringing it up to
Yeah.
22, 23,000.
Right. And if everybody kicked in, that kind of an increase, presumably, they could run the automation system, which is, quite frankly, the most important part. That and delivery is the most critical services we get from Upper Hudson.
Okay, that's okay. Is there, other than the tax levy, are there other income sources that we need to consider might be in decline? Any other major income sources? We've said contributions. We'll try to quantify that too.
Mark, do you have a guess on how much we might see in reduction for contract?
I'm just looking at the budget, and we've got a budget of a little under $1.4 million, and payroll is about almost 1.2 of that. So, not 1.2, excuse me. It's roughly 1. I'm looking at the wrong thing at the same time. So, roughly somewhere in the neighborhood of 65, 70% of our budget is payroll related stuff. Everything else is other expenses. When I look at tax levy is almost $1.2 million of the 1.363900. So the tax levy is the vast majority of where we get our money from. The rest of it adds up to a little less than $200,000. So, if we see fines and fees go down by, 20%, we're only looking at $4,000 there. If we see CDTA money coming down by 20%, we're only looking at, $16,000. They're relatively small.
CDTA is kind of a wash, so
Yeah, I know. I
we
saw
actually
that.
only get about $2,400.
Yeah, but if fundraising goes down by $2,500 and we see a 20%, it's $25,000. We're only talking $5,000. So in the grand scope of things, those reductions are far less worrisome than the $1,178,403 that we have budgeted for tax levy.
They're more like, so even more, kind of being hit from a lot of different sources. Another one is our fines. Those look to be down to about 1/3 of what was budgeted.
Yeah.
So what's the quantity of that? The 1/3 of what was budgeted?
I think around 22,000.
Yeah, fines and fees is budgeted at 20,000. So if we're down a third, you're looking at like $7,000.
So a difference of about 14,000 less.
Yeah.
Than was budgeted. I did look at the 10% and tried to project whether we would run out of money before we got a large influx in the spring from the city. And I had us running out in February by a little bit. And then you never know when you're going to get the money in March. So that was looking at 10%. Yes, it was, not very precise, but I think we have a serious concern.
Mm.
And
All right,
I think, I don't think that saying, oh, well, the amount that we're supposed to get for taxes is any more accurate than looking at expecting to get 10% less. And I don't want to see the library close.
No, neither do we.
Okay, so we've got
Like speculate.
4,000 from ULHS, 2,500 from fundraising, 7,000 from CDTA, and now we're looking at the tax part itself. And this is where we really have a hard one to do. If it's a 1.4 budgeted, what amount do we seriously think may be not collected and not paid? And it would be less impacting this year, but more impacting next year. So,
well,
what?
it may be less impacting this year, or it may not. I mean,
Right.
What we're seeing on a national level, and what's certainly being, despite what's happening in the stock market.
Yes.
The stock market continues to go up, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yes, it does.
If you look at, all you have to do is look at the videos of the lines of cars waiting in line for food around the country right now to know that there is definitely a pretty massive economic impact of this situation, and it's not projected to get better anytime soon.
There's something not connecting for sure.
Yeah.
So, what figure would be a good figure for us to take from the 1.4 million annualized tax levy to anticipate that we might need to make up?
In
15%?
in my business, I would probably, anytime I was faced with a situation like this, I would pick a couple of different numbers. And I think it would be reasonable to say 10 and 20%. And hope that we're not going to have to do it. I think the idea here is really to plan for what we consider to be conservative worst case scenarios. And when I mean conservative, I mean, the ultimate goal is to make sure that the library as a system survives, what may be coming down the road. We don't want to be in a situation where the library runs out of money and has to close.
Well, and that's my concern. And also, I know that the sooner you start saving, the less drastic it is to deal with.
Yeah.
So if we start saving a little bit now, it may prevent us from having to close the library because we have a gap of $100,000 in March. But the longer we wait, the harder it's going to be. Whatever the percentage that we don't get is going to be worse. I'm not sure why people don't feel the figure I came up with based on what happened with the 2008 recession isn't a good figure to bracket. I like your idea, Mark, of, having different scenarios, but, and I was looking at 2010 because that was the first year we were a tax district. And the difference between what we were supposed to get and what we actually got was a 10%, close to 10%. It was about 9%. I would think that's a better figure than most, and anything else one would come up with what kind of impact this financial situation is going to have.
I think 10% is definitely one of the great numbers. I'm a little concerned that the economic situation here is going to be worse than 2008. And I'm an optimist. I'm a very optimistic person.
So let me just conclude this. If we count 2,500 from fundraising, 7,000 from fines, 4,000 from UHLS, and 10%, that would be a targeted of 153,000 reduction. If we did it at 15% instead of 10, it would be add another 60,000, so 213,000. That's sort of the WAG number.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to conclude that. I think if we do that, it certainly is a wild estimation with just guessing. But I think that we may get to firmer numbers as our process goes on.
Right, if we start saving a little now, then get the information from July 31st, we can use that to make a firmer projection as to what.
Well, the exercise that we're in needs to be able to meet the needs now and then the needs for next year budget as well. So it's just an exercise, but I think we have two targets, a range of targets, and it's about where we think we'll be. And in light of where we are, a beginning process, there's so much unknowns. It's amazing. But I think now that gives us some targeted ideas, and we can move into the second part of the meeting, which is what do we do in terms of plans. And I think this process will be one that will be at in more than one meeting. But I had suggested that we start in the way that I described on the agenda, is categorize the costs. But that might be a time-consuming and less productive approach than do we go right for targets. And I think that there's a certain importance of our deliberation because one of the audience is obviously our staff. And if we begin to talk about potentials and how we would manage that, I think we have to be sensitive to the idea of the discussion alone will cause some anxiety, and we need to be sensitive to that. But in the end of this process, the special finance meetings, I would like to get to levels of anticipated actions that we could take if we need to take. And we'll need more information about them. So I had proposed that we look at costs and categorize them. What's not under our control and reduction not feasible, and we could take that off the table. Or we could start from the bottom up, review saving ideas. I think either way, anybody have a idea what might be most useful?
I think, though, that we might need to consider also increased costs, something that's going to cost us more, that we need to plan to deal with. For instance, the PPE equipment, the pandemic precautions that are being undertaken. Those are costs that weren't in our original budget. So, such as, and also the UHLS, again, it's a potential cost increase that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, I think one of the came to my mind when we were talking about the construction fund, that what we don't have in our budget is a prudent reserve. And I know there was a discussion at the building meeting of looking at that as a potential prudent reserve. I think going forward, it would be good for us to begin to budget for a prudent reserve for exactly what you're raising, Marie. The unanticipated additional costs that we may experience. So not having any room in the budget, we then need to look at different categories. And so I think maybe for this coming 21 budget, we could start trying to identify and budget a prudent reserve.
I did look at last year's budget, and it seemed like we had an excess of $20,000 for net income after expenses at the end of the year.
Right.
Some organizations will put that aside into their reserve. The building committee, the construction fund, that's been committed for various projects already. You know, that has been the policy, and that's the current situation, that there are commitments regarding those funds. One of which is the north wall, I believe, masonry work, for which we have a $200,000 grant that we only have until a year from June to use. So it's something that we really need to proceed with and use the match from the construction funds for that to occur.
I know in my orientation to the board, when initial discussion with Paul, well, I asked you what you worry about or what might keep you awake at night, and you said the building costs, because in this old building, there are many things you don't know that you find out because they become known because there is a need. And so that sort of reinforces the importance of the building fund. Because as you described the threat was around issues of maintaining the building, which you described as ongoing and unknown, but a burden because of the age of the building and the complexity of old construction, et cetera. So Well, I'm asking anybody for a suggestion how you would like to proceed on this content item of how we begin to identify potential resources or cost savings, reductions, or however you want to phrase it. And then we'll start trying to see if we can quantify it and continue this process.
How about identifying sources of information that we would use in this process? Guess not.
No, what do you mean? You said something and then you said guess not. Are you unsaying?
Well, no, because people didn't seem to respond.
I
so I
think
thought-
people are thinking, Marie.
Okay,
You gotta give people a moment to think.
I'm a real slow thinker, so I should.
I don't think you are. You're very fast. But when I said to Paul, coming forward with information for us to really review will be important. And we decided we'll start with the budget. We could do that.
Well, if I could chime in at
Yes.
point here, you know, if we're looking at 100,000 or more in terms of cutting back, I mean, the room that we have in the budget is really two major areas, either staffing salaries or the materials budget. Most everything else is pretty much overhead, so that unless you shut off the electricity and the power of the building, et cetera, there's not a lot of wiggle room in some of those expenses. So basically, when we had to save in the past, you know, we had to target staffing and basically the materials budget. One thing right now, as I look at our expenses going forward, when we go through the reopening process, we're only going to be reopening main library. For the curbside service, and then for limited public service, we will just open the main library, mainly because we need to split the staff in two and have two different teams. And in order to do that, we need enough staff. So we don't have enough staff to operate both locations. Lansingburg, as an operation, will run you roughly 200,000 a year, at least. So at some point, I would say if we review the tax collections for July, you know, we might make decision at that point not to reopen Lansingburg at all. And in that case, we'd have to reduce staff accordingly.
Course, that'll have extremely long range.
I'm just, that's a lot to consider.
All sorts of costs.
What's that?
That will have long range consequences and costs, not just the immediate.
Personally,
Gonna be lots of
What-
consequences.
yeah, personally, while I like the idea, my concern with doing something like that would be that it's easy for something like that to become permanent.
Yeah.
We had closed Lansingburg before and then reopened it, so it wasn't permanent.
Yeah.
No, it's kind of like the difference between laying off staff or furloughing staff. With furlough, you have a plan to reopen.
Mhm.
I think that's what you would have in this particular case, but it would be at some point in 2021.
And don't forget, you never reopened Sickaway. That was not
No,
mothballed.
we didn't. That's true. But
Yeah.
we essentially went through a layoff process there. We had no intention of reopening Sickaway.
But still.
There's also there's also the impact to the public. I think when we talk about the library, the recognized value and importance of the library is enormous to the people in the downtown Troy area. The support is firm and enthusiastic. There's a lot of pride in it. But the multiple of people and voters north of Hoosick Street sometimes look at the downtown with some irritation and feel that they do not get the same kind of attention, services, or recognize their importance. And so if we were to close Lansingburg, it might give anti-tax groups a weapon to get very active in our approvals for budgets because we carry it by downtown. But if the Lansingburg people feel that we as a library don't service them or value them, I think it could put us in danger of a negative view on the part of the majority of voters. I also don't know what Troy administration might think about those actions because the council and other decision-making groups have a lot of influence from Lansingburg, and they see themselves as valuable, hanging on, maintaining the city, good taxpayers, and they always worry about return on their dollars coming to them. So I think it would be dangerous to just close Lansingburg because of the effect it might have to motivate people to take a negative view of us.
I wonder whether we should be rejecting options at this point,
No, I think it's
or
an
keeping
option worth
everything
considering.
on the table and then flushing them out and seeing
Yeah.
whether they would be something that would be chosen or not.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, while you were saying that, talking about that, Paul, my mind was going towards abridging hours, using a literary term there. Is there a way to be able to do hour reduction of both libraries to accomplish a similar type of goal, as an overall?
That's really the only way to go in terms of saving it on staffing.
Yeah.
Is to reduce hours. Because right now we just don't have extra staff. We don't have people laying around. So yeah, it would be a reduction of hours, and I'm not sure whether that would have a different or better impact or worse impact. I don't know.
I think we have to look at all of our options. I don't think we have to decide them tonight, but we should certainly be thinking about them.
Yeah, it would definitely be noticeable. I guess too, you have to consider, if we're considering politics, is that, if we put up the scaffolding and start working on the building when we cut hours, what does that look like?
It doesn't look great.
No, I don't think so. But anyway.
But I think that in this time right now, the time that we're in right now, from the things that I'm hearing out there, is people are being given more time to do things. Because if there's a grant sitting out, there's a very good possibility that any construction grants that we may have, we won't be held to the deadlines that we're held to. It's possible we will be, but we might actually be given more time, particularly in light of if we've got to be, providing matching funds in order to be able to do some kind of major construction. There's a decent shot that we'll be able to get extensions.
Is that true, Paul? You had indicated that wasn't the case.
My experience with the grant, which goes back 30 years, there will be no extensions on the state construction grant. That's in legislation, and DLD can't change that. And the state education department can't change that. And the fact that the legislature ever changing that is probably a pretty dim hope. Um,
And we've also had this grant for 2 years, so
To proceed as if there's not going to be an extension on that, and we need to probably make that decision fairly soon to go ahead.
What is the amount that we have to put in?
Oh, gosh.
I think it's about 100,000.
Yeah, it's at least that.
The state
I don't have the exact.
is about 200,000.
But it takes up a, what do you call, maybe 3/4 of what's in that reserve fund, at least? Or-
About half, I would say.
Yeah,
It's not a reserve fund, it's the construction account.
yeah, right.
So it's, and it's essentially, we have made commitments and said that we had this money available in accepting grant.
Let me come back to some of the issues raised. Paul, I think for me, what would be helpful to me is understand our staffing and utilization in regards to the services provided. So having a list of all staff with then the things I began to outline in the agenda. I don't know how they're scheduled, for example. Are there groups that work together? Are there teams? Are there linked assignments to schedules? I think what we really need to do in this committee is get into the mechanics of how we do that. And so the idea of understanding how we deploy our resources to what end, and then look at the ends. Do we curtail some of them, and what's the effect? So I think for the next meeting, we would need a list of the staff and how they're commonly deployed, if they're linked or not linked. And if we're getting a list of staff, the categories of information that we would want for future use. Seniority, compensation. Is there a union? When the question came up, I think it was Evelyn, but I'm not sure who. If we're going to have staff discussions, are we going to have representation from staff to participate in that? Are the staff unionized? Do they have representatives?
They're not.
So are there common representatives? Are people in seniority or management positions often providing discussions to the board or administration commonly?
Have our departments, and they certainly are interested.
The
Have
conversation
opinions.
is going in a little direction that I'm not comfortable with. The staffing of the library is basically my responsibility, and I staff it to the level that it's needed to provide the services that we provide. I don't think it's part of this committee to say we need to cut back $100,000. I then go back and do that based on laying off the staff, parts of the staff that we have. And then I can let you know the kind of hours that results in.
Paul,
It's a board's responsibility.
resources that the staff
This kind of work.
are not yours alone. And for us to really do this job, you're going to have to share the information and the responsibility. If you're putting up a fence over which we can't enter, we can't do this job very effectively. And so you personally don't have entire control of the staff. We're the trustees, you're the management. We work together, but you can't take something as important as a staff and say that's yours and not available for detailed discussions with us in this particular meeting as it goes forward. It just would make this ineffective and limited. And yes, it's very uncomfortable. All of the ideas that are going across our whole nation these days are drastic. But we're just doing a drill here. And we can't take an important resource and say it can't be included in the discussion. And we can't understand it better. We have an obligation to understand it better, how the staff are deployed.
There's also the civil service constraints because they're not unionized, but they are civil service employees. And it's important to know what those constraints are in trying to make the best decisions.
The constraints are pretty straightforward. The constraints are you must lay off in seniority order in each class.
And but that's not the only option to consider. What about reducing hours or, you know, I don't know what all the options are, but it's not just furlough or not furlough. There must be variations that can exist.
Who would a staff person go to find out compliance with civil service protections? Where would they go for that as a resource? If they had a question about their entitlements under civil service, where would they get that information from? Or where would you get that information?
Is published. There's civil service handbooks. There's state civil service regulations that are published. Relatively easy to find on the internet.
Are some things in the personnel policy too?
Yeah, there's things in the personnel.
The manual, I should say, the
But
personnel
The
manual.
personnel policy primarily says that we follow civil service regulation because we don't reiterate all of the civil
Right.
service
But
regulations.
there's some cut and paste.
Yeah. But no.
If you Google civil,
Question, I might direct it to the local civil service office. The city of Troy is our civil service office. If I need to, I might have to go to attorneys, but rarely do you do because, as I said, all those regulations are easily available.
when you say the civil service office, where is that and who runs it? Is it state civil service?
Right.
Troy,
Pardon?
the city of Troy.
So you would go to City Hall to consult with people in City Hall about civil service regulation?
Well, I usually call them up, but
Now,
they come to see our civil service as far as regulations and so on are concerned.
when I was on the council, I had the idea that the person who was the HR person dealing with civil service was one individual. And so that's where people would go for guidance in terms of personnel actions, for example. When you say you'd call them up, who would you call?
There's a director of civil service.
Well, it must be a person answers the phone, right?
Yeah.
Who?
I can't remember her name.
Okay, well, we'd like to identify that
I'm
person.
getting at here, actually. So
Pardon?
we are under all districts go to the closest civil service office. The closest civil service office is Troy. We go through them and they oversee our compliance with civil service regulation.
Right, and they are within the administration of the city of Troy and City Hall.
Yeah.
Okay. It probably might be good to start to reach out to that person in terms of trying to understand guidance about potential changes. You know, I understand you're saying seniority, but you still might change something, and then people bid for it based on seniority, and you may, change one person's job, but it may affect, it's like a system. So someone else may have a right to bid, or then seniority becomes important. But if we did make a design decision, then the implementation becomes very important to follow all the legalities of civil service entitlement. What we're seeing in other cities, Albany and Schenectady and Cohoes, Watervliet, is there are people beginning to take actions in the area that we're meeting about. What do you do in a crisis? And they're already furloughing in Albany. So this is pretty active. I think that with our limited target of 210,000 as a top, or 156, whatever it was, I don't see us as drastic, but I do see us as needing to really understand deployment and where our costs are. How might we want to approach that particular issue?
Would it be possible, Paul, if you had those two numbers, for you to go and take a run through what you would propose to do? What were the numbers again, Bob? 156 and 200, roughly?
Yeah, 153,500 and 213,000.
And 213. If you could do kind of rough, guesses of how you would cut those out of the budget, and bring it back to us. That broad stroke.
I think the question though is, okay, let's say it's 200,000. Now, do you mean between now and December, or now and sometime into next year? In other words, 12 months or 6 months?
So what I mean is that it would be an annualized basis. So
Okay.
If we need to cut, say July 1st, I'm assuming that January 1st, we're not going to suddenly be awash in cash. I'm assuming that if we're going to make a cut, we're going to have to make a cut until we find that our revenue sources are starting to replenish or grow again, in which case we can start adding back on. So even though it may be in some point in the year, we need to be able to plan for, what would the annualized operation look like based on those adjustments.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense.
I just want to stop for a minute and frame something. What we're doing here is a tabletop process. We will not be making changes unless we then determine as a group that it's necessary based on our actual resources and what we're dealing with day to day. What we're doing is a planning process to see what ifs. And so it's important that we view it as this, because we're not developing an action plan that then is going to be implemented until the need to implement it is absolutely known. We're not going to affect people's lives because of what might happen in the environment. We're going to affect them by planning well now so that we can react appropriately when we're faced with the actual deficit.
I'm not sure I agree.
Deficit.
I'm not sure I agree with that, because the impact on people is going to be greater if we delay. So, no, the sooner if we do determine that it looks likely that we'll have a deficit, the sooner that we start implementing a plan, the less the magnitude of the impact will be.
The last thing we want is a ball rolling downhill, gathering steam.
So for instance, if we implement small reductions starting July 1st, we may avoid closing down in March, the month of March, which to me would be a big impact on both our staff and our patrons at a time that the services will be especially needed because of the financial situation. So time is important here, time. We can't wait until we definitely know things to start taking some actions at least.
Well, I just think if we have concrete ideas of saving opportunities and some of them make sense, we could do them. But to take actions against the staff while you have the resources that don't force those actions, it would be more reasonable to wait for attrition and your targets that way. But we don't have a plan. So I think we need to get to the content of what we're doing. This conversation is very powerfully important, but I think we need to be concrete about what our product is. And then we can, a second thing would be, what do we do with implementation? And where are we on implementation? Because I think the idea of developing plans that impact people are in itself traumatic for people. And we need to maintain our responsibility to be stable and supportive to the staff. So let's just get to our plan as best we can. And then the issue that you may need to implement that. And I'm not both going to do a plan and commit to implementation in the same process, because I would do it in a different way. If I was forced to be implementing the dollar change, it would be very specific. So that's just my feeling about the leadership. What I envisioned in this process of special finance planning is building drills that could be applied to meet needs as they're encountered. And as we started out with, where are we? We're not encountering anything right this moment. So both restating our position. So,
Bob, are you in a way reiterating what Mark said about, I will call it a certain surgical approach, that you go from this is what happens at 10%, this is what happens at 15, 20, and you cut that way?
I think what Bob is saying is you need to have a plan in place so you know what you're going to do in the event you're faced with something, rather than, and this is the time to do that.
X, Y, and Z. It's like, well, a surgeon will try to take this part, during with, let's say, MRSA, you take this part, you take that part, then you keep going further till it's gone. But I just will reiterate, especially when you talk about staffing, that the consequences of our actions will be costly in the long run, financially, there's so many costs to that service-wise, to that taxpayer. In the long run, there's going to be effects that we have to be incredibly aware of and cautious about. We've done our best to bolster staff over these last years, and to lose that and lose the staff that we have, I think would be very detrimental to what this library is. But it's just something I want
We've
I need
got
to see
about
that.
15 minutes left. Was I cutting you off, Evelyn?
Oh, no, no. Thanks, Bob. No, I'm good.
Okay, I agree with you entirely, but what we didn't get to, we're starting to outline where we'll go with staff versus, I think, Mark's comment to you. Let's take a look about if we close Lansingburg. Let's start on our conclusion and wrap up to give ourselves tasks between now and the next time. But what we haven't done was what I had in the agenda and a generalized, can we categorize expenses in these categories, A, B, C, D? Because it's not realistic in my mind to say something as large as the organization we have, all contracts have to remain exactly as they are. I think we need to look at our expenses in depth. What can be renegotiated? What could be done in a different way? What could be contracted out? So all of those things are options as well. But we need to understand the staffing costs and what they're tied to, either both in the service products or the locations. We really do want to understand those, Paul. And I think it's important to participate in this wholeheartedly.
I also think that we shouldn't just assume, oh, we're going to have to do drastic things to staff, at least initially. We could try to look for small savings that don't involve staff to begin with.
Do you have
And
anything in mind?
I don't at the moment, but I think that this session is supposed to be the beginning of trying to identify all the options. I think we have a lot of creative and knowledgeable people on the board, and I think all that can be brought to bear on this problem we're facing.
Yeah, one of the things we could do is simply not fix the building, and that gets us halfway to our big goal. Of course, that creates a whole different problem down the road because the building eventually has to be fixed. That's not, I'm not recommending that that's the decision we make, but that is, that's a big number there. If we've got to take $100,000 out of, what we have and put towards a project that probably should have been done 20 years ago.
Well, and I think we should consider all those options.
Yeah.
I don't believe that we should rule anything out at this time. Let's say that we decided not to spend money on materials. Well, if we turned out to be wrong and we could have spent that money on materials, then we can spend it on materials later. And yet that wouldn't have an impact on staff. So I think we need to look, as Bob said, at all the areas for cost savings, and not just jump to the fear that we all have, that we have to take action that would require impacts on the reductions in staff.
I've already really looked at a number of things in terms of reduction, and we could do some reduction, for example, in the materials budget. We do have some funding in the maintenance budget that we could cut back and not do a couple of things that we were going to do. But so far, I just want to tell you, I've been looking at nickels and dimes, and when the answer comes up, it's still nickels and dimes. I can't find 100 or 200,000 that way. I mean,
Can you find 5,000 if we
5,000? Sure, cut that right out of the book budget.
Right. Well, that's the kind of thing that we might start with. At least we'll be saving some money in anticipation until we get better information July 31st. At least we're starting to be concerned and trying to get ready for the future and what that might bring. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. Yes, we should be considering the more drastic way of cutting, but only, if we find that's necessary, we can do that. But let's at least start doing some savings to put us in a better position
No, I
now,
mean,
rather than just spending as though we're not expecting anything.
I have been working with that, but I want to tell you too, at the same time I'm working with that, the personal protection equipment budget is way out, you know.
I'm
So
not
it's
surprised.
kind of like a push and shove here, trying to, you know, plug in some of those savings.
And that's
Um,
why you don't have a reserve fund, because you've always tried to make the most of the money we've had, Paul.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
We've just got 10 minutes left. I want to use the last 5 minutes for listing some tasks. Paul, the one question I had, in this age of pandemic, it seems to me there's so much needed in terms of safety that we didn't think of 9 months ago. And now there are some implications where we need more money for semi-medical expenses, testing, and equipment to take people's temperatures to be admitted, or plexiglass, or different structural changes. In the area of safety, do you have any sense of potential increased expenditures that we'll need to do?
No, I have not, I haven't got a number on that. You know, we're saving a certain amount on supplies because we're simply not open. I mean, paper supplies, you know, toilet paper, who knows? You know, we're simply not open or haven't been open. So there's some savings there, but then the expense of the PPE can easily offset that. But I don't have totals yet. As a matter of fact, we're still working on getting an inventory of what we do have. Because that's going to be critical in the reopening process. We need to make sure we have, you know, everything in stock.
Have you thought of any measures of screening or keeping the staff safe from the virus?
Yeah, that's in our next meeting. But yeah, we need, the employer has to provide PPE for the staff.
And
So,
testing? Have we thought of testing?
well, gloves, masks, you know, protection from, you know, like the sneeze guards and all that. I tell you,
Testing of
I
whom?
think the bundle on this.
I know, for example, in reopening, an example was given of a barbershop or beauty salon where one worker had direct contact with 92 people while they had symptoms. So I think staff may be interested in themselves, keeping themselves safe if they're interacting with the public. So we may need to think about potential safety costs going forward, whether it's toward interventions with our people entering the building, or whether it's for our own staff and comfort. There may be some costs. I'm sure somebody's going to be wanting to sell us staff health services in a different way in 2 months. So let's, if we could, I think, how often might we want this group to meet?
I think the big question is how long, Paul, till you could have a first draft of those cuts would be the next time we would take. We'd have something tangible to talk about.
It's a little tough to estimate at the moment. While everybody is staying home, I'm really working full time.
That's why I asked the question.
The opening is going to be very time consuming, at least for me. But, you know, it may take me sometime in the middle of June, maybe. At least that long to, you know, be able to sit down and kind of work some numbers.
So that being the case, is there something that we can do to lessen the amount of time you need to put in on this? Or can,
Continued talk to city representatives doesn't hurt, you know?
but I mean, in helping identify our budget. I don't think they have anything more to offer on what we can expect
But
with the July 31st.
they may have, you know, new insight, but yeah, I mean, if people have ideas in terms of when they look at the budget, if you have, you know, you see something, you know, it might help to point that out and ask me, maybe there is some savings there that I overlooked. So I'm open for, you know, suggestions as we go along. Like I said, it's an awful lot of looking at nickels and dimes in the budget, and but yeah, more than one pair of eyes is always good.
I'd like to also maybe get some bucket things. So for example, what would we want to know if we talk to a civil service person? We can start making a document in which we put information we'd like to have. When we feel satisfied that it's we could have a worthwhile meeting, then we would have a meeting. So there's some tasks for this we can build over time. But looking at information will be important, Paul. So what I suggest we'll do is I'll try to draft minutes. I would like to then pass them by Mark, Marie, and you, Paul.
And Evelyn?
So we can go and then see if we can finalize that. Is there anyone else that would want an input before we finalize minutes? Would you-
Evelyn,
Don't forget me.
Pardon?
you're so quiet, Evelyn.
I know someone like me, right?
All right.
Yeah, you know what's funny, Evelyn? You in your posture, you're a little further away from your computer. I have a Bose system, so I can turn the sound up and down. But Paul is right near, and so when he speaks, I turn down. When you speak, I gotta turn up, and I sometimes miss the first thing. So
I'm literally an arm's length away. That's it. Just, believe it or not, I am soft-spoken.
all right, let's try. Let me try to do that. Are there any important things that people want to be sure that we'll record, or just do a draft and send it around? And please be liberal about your contribution.
By any chance, is Joy recording this? There's this little.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, it's recorded.
We've got, this for backup too.
Yep, it's being recorded.
I thought so.
Okay, very good. All right, well, we've got 3 extra minutes. Shall we close the meeting? Or is there anybody else who would like to make any more comments about it?
Well, does anyone need a break before going on to the next meeting?
Okay, so
Yeah.
you're suggesting we end the meeting now?
I don't know whether people need a break.
Okay.
they?
I needed one about 30 minutes ago, but I might as well go now.
Good, Paul. All right, then we'll stand adjourned. Yeah, thank you.
So Joy, do you want to stop recording for 3 minutes?
Sure, I can do that.